I would like to welcome you to the Polish Economic Institute. Uh, it's not that often that we do organize events in-house, but together with the Swedish Embassy, and I'd like to thank them for co-organizing with us this discussion today, with the Swedish presidency as well. We have the chance and opportunity to do that. Single market is one of the most important topics in our research. As the Polish Economic Institute, we deeply believe that everybody benefits from the single market. If you look around on the econometric research conducted from the 80s up until now, every country is richer by 4 to 10 or even more percent because of the single market and no tariffs between the European countries. And the single market is not complete. So the story still is very interesting. And this is probably what the panelists are going to discuss. So I warmly welcome you to the Polish Economic Institute, together with the ambassador, Stefan Gurgren, the ambassador of Sweden. Mr. Ambassador, Your Excellency, please come to me.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Let me say that we are extremely grateful to the Polish Economic Institute to host this event, and it's an event that we are organizing together, but without you and without your staff, we would of course not be here today. As you may know, the Swedish presidency set 4 main priorities, one of them being competitiveness and how to raise the competitiveness of the European Union. And at the core of the competitiveness agenda is, of course, the internal market, which we celebrate this year, actually these days, 30 years since it was put into place. But while celebrating its past, we need to look to the future. And we thought that this would be a good opportunity to have a discussion here in Warsaw about the future of the internal market, its great potential, because Poland, I think, is a country which shows very clearly the enormous potential of the internal market and how much it has meant for the growth and prosperity of Poland. We know that also from our own experience in Sweden, and to have a discussion between experts, not only experts from government, but also with representatives from business. I think we will all leave this seminar, I hope, a bit wiser and with some more ideas about what we can do with the internal market. Let me also take this opportunity to say thank you to my friend and colleague Anders Ahnlid for coming to Warsaw from Stockholm this morning. Just a few words to introduce you. We were colleagues for many years in the Foreign Service. Anders Ahnlid is now Director General of the Swedish National Board of Trade, which is the Swedish Authority for Trade and Investment. Is actually one of the oldest Swedish authorities, founded in 1651, one of the original Swedish authorities. Before taking up this position, Anders Ahnlid was Director General for Trade at the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. That is the most senior position in the Ministry on Foreign Trade. He has been a permanent representative to the OECD and permanent representative to the European Union, also ambassador to Finland, so extremely well placed to explain how the internal market has benefited Sweden. And of course, together with Minister Konrad Szymański, with your long background from European Union affairs, both in the European Parliament and in the Polish government, I think you two, as our introductory speakers, will really be able to set the tone, and then we have the panel discussion after that. So I will look forward to this with eager interest. And again, thank you for hosting us.
Thank you, Your Excellency. So, with no further ado, I would like to introduce Konrad Szymański to have the first speech, and then Anders Ahnlid as the second speaker, and then we're going to have a panel discussion. Konrad.
I think it's more available now. Okay. The Ambassador Gulgren, Director Anilt, Director Arak. Polish-Swedish seminar on the internal market is a perfect match. Both our countries, Poland and Sweden, sharing many common positions on strategic European affairs, belong to most vocal promoters of single market of the European Union. It is not accidental. We are also beneficiaries of trade integration of Europe. 30 years of European single market hasn't been celebrated properly for many reasons. We are still in economic recovery after pandemic. We have war in Ukraine, which threatens our own security as frontline countries. Our strategic dependencies means we have to recalibrate our trade policies, and all three things in the same time. So it's obvious that there are many objective reasons for this. But are we sure that without these extraordinary circumstances, we would celebrate 13th anniversary of European single market properly? I am not. It is a paradox that most successful European integration achievement, custom union and single market, is constantly overshadowed by everyday fatigue and sometimes abstract debates about the future of our continent. Internal market is something real and tested. We should do our best to protect it. It can't be neglected, forgotten, or underestimated. The European single market has contributed to impressive economic growth in Central Europe and in Poland specifically. We estimate that Polish integration into the EU has increased our GDP per capita by 31% in terms of purchasing power parity, according to our calculation made in our Common Market Report published last month. Around 1/4 of Polish GDP is contingent on the final demand of other members of Common Market. 3.3 million jobs in Poland exist because of the EU demand. European Commission estimates that the lack of trade barriers in Common Market has increased EU GDP by 9%. Other estimates range from 3 to more than 10%. Taking into account the financial effect of EU membership, member states are often divided into two groups: net contributors and net beneficiaries. Both two groups are well represented today. Yet this simplistic approach doesn't take into account what business owners and governments in Europe realized years ago. The economic impact of 2004 enlargement provided the whole EU15, the so-called old EU, with a significant number of additional euros. This was highest in Luxembourg, where each citizen received almost 6,600 per capita euro. Austria was the second, with close to 1,800 euro. The impact was smallest in Portugal, Spain, and France, but still, in case of France, it's 260 euro per capita. In case of Sweden, it's one of the best achievements. It is about 900 euro per capita. This is the result of trade integration in Europe after enlargement of 2004 and the other enlargement after that time. Single market is not a zero-sum game. Whole European Union and every single member state is a net beneficiary of trade integration, is a net beneficiary of EU membership. Convergence isn't granted for all without efforts in capitals and on other fronts of integration. As we outline in our other report, 30 years of Maastricht Treaty, we published a couple of months ago, while Central European countries have been steadily converging with Western EU in terms of GDP per capita, the inequality within EU15 has increased between 1995 and 2020. This was mostly due to the 2008 financial crisis, but it's obvious that the trend started much earlier. Between 2010 and 2020, the GDP per capita of Greece contracted by 20%, in case of Italy by 8.6%, in case of Spain by 2.9%. Divergence is a problem, also political problem, but opposite to conventional truth in public debates, especially in southern countries, it is not the single market to be blamed, just opposite. We need to complete and develop single market to make a convergence machine effective and working. One of the biggest challenges is removing barriers to the single market in the services sector. Services account for around 70% of EU GDP and 73% of total employment. It has been estimated by the European Commission that removing barriers at member states level to the single market for goods and services could add benefits of 700 billion euro to the EU economy by the end of 2029. The Commission also indicates that the most promising industries for breaking down barriers are retail, construction, tourism, business services, and renewable energy sources. According to the communication of the European Commission made in 2020, relatively little progress has been made in removing barriers to the services sector, with 60% of barriers reported by companies today are of the same type and nature as those reported 20 years ago. Annual report on the European SMEs 2017-18 found that 63% of SMEs face problems with dealing with foreign taxation issues. The Black Book issued by the Polish Ministry of Economy mentioned, for example, the problem of requiring entrepreneurs to open a separate bank account in foreign country for the purpose of tax paying, which is additional administrative burden for entrepreneurs. Internal market is still waiting for completion, but now new obstacles are on the rise with the protectionist consequences. Changes introduced by mobility package or posting directive is a good example, with quite a negative impact on mobility of Polish posted workers and European economy, European services. According to the study by PricewaterhouseCoopers published in 2020, 20% of EU delegated workers came from Poland. In a survey, more than a fifth of those surveyed say the new rules will negatively impact their business by reducing revenue or increasing the cost of their services. It is the right moment to say a word about Polish membership in the European Union. 20 years ago, our accession treaty has been signed. Polish membership in the EU, in spite of the fact of temporary tensions, is a success story. Not only our development and welfare, but also our security, not to mention sovereignty, is better protected in the European Union and international organization of the Western world. Internal market helps to understand the sense and success of Polish membership in the EU. Like any other country, we experience controversies regarding economic solutions and political choices made in European Union. Fair burden sharing in climate transformation, fair rules of competition, especially in services, protectionist tendencies, or simply cost of regulation are key problems and will stay with us for a longer time. However, if we stop at this, we would have a caricature of image of Poland's membership in the EU and the European Union itself. Sometimes you can get the impression that we, as Poland, and as European Union as a whole, are very exposed to assimilating such a caricatures, fake news, or even planned disinformation. Convergence of Central European countries was a resounding success. Since the year 2000, Poland's GDP per capita has increased from 50% of the EU average to 78%. In the longer but already visible perspective, this means that Poland, like any other developed EU country, will become a net contributor to the EU budget. Therefore, it is a high time to talk about much greater and lasting benefits resulting from the trade integration within European Union. Otherwise, we risk a growing and well-known budgetary populism, which has been shaking the most developed EU countries politically since at least 2008. The net position in the EU budget is not the key to understand the sense of EU membership. It is successful trade integration and competitiveness of the economy in the common EU market which matters. But internal market is not granted. We live in extraordinary times since 2008 at least, and our temporary measures becomes a new norm in many aspects. EC, European Commission, approved 134 billion euro of state aid in 2019. In 2020, it was 384 billion euros. In 2021, European Commission approved 672 billion euro of state aid, where 53% were allocated in one country, Germany, 24 in France and 7.6 in Italy. With American plans to subsidize clean technologies, we will face a new pressure to put even more money to our economies, and only one thing is sure: we face a growing risk of disintegration of internal single market. Most effective and successful driver of development, welfare and convergence, also political convergence in Europe. Subsidy race between member states has to be stopped. We need European solutions to protect market and level playing field, especially in clean technologies. In place of subsidy race and disintegration of single market, we need a European solution for third country subsidies and pan-European geographically equal fair distribution of opportunities in Europe. It means that we need more integrated and completed European market, European and fair redistribution of money for innovation in Europe, and in case of allies, more trade agreements, not wars. We need more co-ownership and fairness in climate and energy transition. This is a specifically sensitive issue in Poland. Fair burden sharing is far from excellence, and it poses a risk for European climate consensus. But climate transition is not only about fair burden sharing and poverty risks. It is also about fair distribution of new economic and business opportunities to activate the whole European potential, not the potential of the very few well-known centers. Open markets and transparent regulatory framework are in the interest of Poland and Sweden and the whole EU as the world's leading trading region. But the pandemic and Russian invasion of Ukraine made the question of moving production for safer places increasingly present in the public debate. Friendshoring, nearshoring, and reshoring have become important subjects in the public debate. We present a specific data about, let's say, state of play in this regard in our new report, the new phase of global trade, Are We Dealing with Reshoring, published last weeks. It is another example of current challenges where we need careful cooperation and recalibration rather than the revolution of trade policy. To conclude, let me thank Swedish Embassy and Ambassador personally, Ambassador Gullgren, for cooperation in this seminar. As advocates of single market, we need to put attention of the whole EU to trade integration, to protect achievements already done and develop a single market for future. We need to explain all benefits to our nations and our parliaments, to avoid collateral damage of our new industrial and innovation policies. We need better burden sharing of cost and better opportunity sharing in climate and energy transition. In a wider world, as we have to recalibrate our trade dependencies, we have to do it keeping costs under control and our allies as close as possible. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Director Andreas Sandlet, please. Floor is yours.
Minister, ambassadors, directors, dear friends, it is a great pleasure and privilege for me to speak at this conference. And I also wish to thank warmly the Polish Economic Institute and the Embassy of Sweden for arranging the conference and for inviting me. As Ambassador Gullgren explained, I am in charge of the National Board of Trade. And it's not only an old agency in Sweden, it's also one that I believe is dealing with very important current issues, as we just heard about the importance of the EU internal market or the EU single market. The National Board of Trade is the government of Sweden's agency for international trade, the EU single market and trade policy. And from that point of view, evidently, the single market is very dear and important to us. I am also pleased that this conference takes place as part of the Swedish presidency of the Ministerial Council of the European Union. And the motto for the presidency, as you are well aware, is that we are having the presidency for a greener, safer, and freer Europe. It's equally evident that a more competitive and better functioning single market is crucial for achieving that Europe, and therefore also natural that the evolution of the single market and its contribution to EU competitiveness is an important objective and priority for the Swedish presidency. Now, today, the importance of the single market is unfortunately also highlighted by the unstable regional and global situation. Russia's barbaric war in Ukraine is not only a terrible catastrophe for Ukraine and its brave people, it has also fueled an energy crisis, high inflation, and many other economic effects that affect us all. In addition, tensions between the United States and China caused doubt about the future of the global trading system. And in this context, the single market is key as provider of resources that we need in our European Union for our safety and for defending our freedom. As the single market turns 30, it has become an integral part of everyday life for citizens and businesses alike. It delivers economic well-being on a daily basis, not least shown by the success story of Poland. And the single market is today easily taken for granted. But, and it was also evident from the presentation that Conrad made before me, it cannot be taken for granted, and there is not room for complacency in this regard. We were all reminded about the fragility of the single market during the corona pandemic, with sudden closures of national borders. But thanks to, not least, the European Commission, the integrity of the internal market was quite rapidly re-established. Today, we understand better the importance of a single market that works also during a crisis. And maintaining free movement is a cornerstone of European resilience. And that is why it is important to get a good result now, for instance, in the ongoing work on the single market emergency instrument that is worked on during the Swedish presidency. But while crisis management skills are necessary, they are not sufficient to build long-term economic success and prosperity in our European Union. It is a fact that Europe is lagging behind the United States and China in terms of productivity and economic growth. The EU's real GDP has grown slightly more than 1% a year over the last 10 years, and of course with individual differences between individual member states, while China's grew by 8% a year. During the same time frame, the EU share of global gross domestic product fell from 21 to 17%, while the US share did grow from 21 to 24, and the Chinese share from around 10 to 18%. Also, another example, between 2014 and 2019, European firms on average grew 40% more slowly than US firms, and European firms invested 40% less in research and development. Now, this evidently has to change. The single market, put in this light, do not provide sufficiently good economic framework conditions to make it possible for us in the European Union to keep up in the same economic pace as other countries, other partners. And again, that is something which leads to need for improvements of our internal single market. In addition to this challenge, we see how increased fragmentation of the single market, stemming from a large number of new and uncoordinated regulations, risks worsening this situation, as does the loosening up of the strict EU state aid regime. As we heard previously, that this is indeed a big worry for many. Selective subsidies favoring selected industries, risk lifting the selected sector on the expense of other sectors, and thereby making the economy less productive, not more productive. So, while the single market is crucial to the functioning of the EU economy, and while it is delivering a lot, there are challenges for the future that need to be seriously and expeditiously tackled. So, how can we adapt and improve the single market to continue to deliver under these new preconditions and these new realities in terms of both technological change and in terms of a new geopolitical reality? In order to try to contribute to an answer to that question, as we've heard, the Swedish presidency made it a priority to put European competitiveness at the top of its EU presidency agenda. We need a EU competitiveness policy that focuses on robust framework conditions, that fosters a productive business community. Here, of course, investment in education, well-functioning capital markets, physical and digital infrastructure, and in the green transition is at the core. But there is also need for other measures to be taken. And I just want to reiterate that, as you know, in March, the European Council agreed to address EU long-term competitiveness for the future by directing attention to 3 areas. First of all, creating a predictable and innovation-friendly regulatory framework for growth and productivity. Very important. Second, to promote an increasing rate of investment in research and development. Of course, main task for the business community, but also important that the environment is encouraging such a direction. And thirdly, the need to deepen and strengthen the single market, including the digital single market and the market for services, as we heard, by creating the right environment, not least for digital networks and services, and better access for consumers and businesses to online goods and services across Europe. During the Swedish presidency, progress has been made in order to improve the single market. There is now a provisional deal on the Chips Act. It's not perfect, but the act will support the green and digital transition while strengthening EU resilience in turbulent times. We have also achieved an agreement in the Council on the short-term rental proposal and made progress on eco-design of products and the single market emergency instrument that I mentioned before. And the Swedish presidency, of course, will continue to push negotiations forward before we hand over to the the presidency to the Spanish friends in the end of June. Now, for the coming period, my agency, the National Board of Trade, has pointed at 3 important aspects for the further improvement of the single market. First of all, we feel that it is important that the European Commission and member states again in reality prioritize all the 4 freedoms for goods, services, capital and people in all economic sectors of our European Union. Our European Union cannot afford to maintain what to a large extent is still 27 different regulatory regimes, in particular in the services area and, for instance, in telecommunications. There are huge gains to be made by getting rid of these barriers. We heard the figure of stunning 700 billion euros until the end of this decade. Secondly, we have in the National Board of Trade previously proposed to improve compliance management in the single market through decentralized enforcement of EU law. We have pointed to the possibility of instituting a single market ombudsman to improve compliance, and we now welcome the Commission's proposal to instigate a single market office as a member state enforcer of single market rules. This, we believe, could be an important step forward towards making the single market function better. And thirdly, it is key that the trend towards increased fragmentation be halted and the course towards harmonization be re-entered. Today, we meet too many Swedish companies and companies in other countries that are worried that the new regulations on, for example, circularity and digitalization leave too much discretion for specific member state regulation in a way that infringe on free movement. But the single market alone cannot improve EU competitiveness. The single market has to continue also to be open and ideally more open to the rest of the world in order to make sure that EU industries uphold productivity and remain competitive. Here, increasing resort to elements of import substitution in EU regulations is worrying. Instead, we should improve openness for trade with trusted partners and allies. We should strive, we believe, towards doing away with trade barriers to import of intermediary goods. We should continue to push existing free trade agreement negotiations forward, continue to seek to establish a transatlantic free trade area, even if the Americans presently are not interested in such an outcome. And we should continue to try to link us in Europe, link us up with partners around the Pacific Ocean to a better extent than what is presently the case. And of course, also the EU must continue to believe in and promote trade liberalization in the World Trade Organization. There aren't many partners of size that are doing that presently, key for the European Union. I look very much forward to discuss these and other single market issues at today's conference. Thank you so much for your attention.
Thank you very much. And now for a short presentation from Marek Wąsiński, who's going to chair the panel discussion afterwards. So Marek, the head of the Global Economy team at the Polish Economic Institute.
Thank you very much, and thank you very much especially for those 2 excellent interventions before myself. Actually, a lot of topics were already mentioned, so let me emphasize some successes of single market and reiterate what is still to be done. But first, technical issue need to be solved. Thank you. Single market was established actually 35 years ago in 1987 by Single European Act, but entered into force in 1993. After EU enhancements, it reached 500 million consumers in 2019. But what maybe wasn't mentioned before is one of things that happened recently and was a drawback and actually it was a loss for a single market. It was Brexit, and this decreased market, single market to 450 million consumers. The same happened with the EU GDP that decreased from 17 trillion in 2021. So it reached 17 trillion in 2021, but would have been near $20 trillion if not for Brexit. Actually, what Mr. Szymański already said, without the single market, EU GDP would be lower by 9%. And we achieved it because of 4 freedoms that we have established with the single market. This is, first of all, movement of goods. Intra-EU exports accounted for 3.5 trillion euro in 2021. Movement of services reached almost 1 trillion euro in 2021, and it's only trade in services inside the single market. Movement of capital is especially important, with foreign direct investments of EU member states in other EU member states exceeded 8 trillion euro in 2021. Last but not least, movement of employees, and here we can see that share of persons with citizenship of another EU member state working in EU member state exceeded 3.4% in 2021. I'm not sure which one, so maybe let me ask to switch the slide. One back, please. So to reiterate it on the graph, the intra-EU trade grew 6-fold between 1993 and 2022. We see a decrease due to financial crisis and big decrease amid pandemic, but still this happened first and foremost because of lack of barriers on the single market. And let me shortly move to Poland and Polish success on the single market that we described in our recent report on the 30th anniversary of single market. Poland is a great example of economic success of EU integration and participation in the single market. So based on our calculations, based on synthetic control method, we calculated that 31% GDP per capita in purchase power parity would be lower if we had not joined the EU. Poland observed growth rate per capita 1.5 percentage points higher than in an alternative scenario that we didn't join the single market. One of the main drivers of this success, and particularly important for Poland, is trade in goods. Polish merchandise trade grew 5-fold, while import increased 3-fold. That made Poland note high trade surplus with the EU member states that reached 60 billion euro in 2021. Other publications show also high positive impact of the single market. Also, case study show 1/3 lower GDP per capita if Poland had not joined the EU. Benefits of the single market account for almost 11% of GDP. That is about 60 billion euro. Also, profits of trade liberalization reached 382 euro per capita annually. And in contrary scenario, so if we take a look into United Kingdom, so here United Kingdom observed loss of 5.5 GDP due to Brexit. Taking next slide, please. Taking a deeper look into the data of trade in value added, as mentioned by Mr. Szymański, we can see that quarter of Poland's economy depends on the European Union. And here we have two flows why this happens. First of all, it's a direct impact of EU's final demand for Polish value added in products and services. But second part of it is the indirect factor, that is the export of Polish goods and services, so Polish value added in goods and services exported by other EU member states. And those two flows make a quarter of Polish GDP depending on the EU. And actually the share of EU countries grew by 7 percentage points between 2004 and 2018. This can be also measured in comparison to other countries when we try to see the convergence mentioned. Poland's GDP per capita accounted for 77% of EU average. That is, development gap decreased by 26 percentage points in the years 2004-2021. We can see the convergence happening also with single member states like Germany, as well as even more stronger convergence with Spain, reaching 92% of Spanish GDP in 2021. Then what is also important for Polish economy, this trend hasn't been halted by the pandemic. But single market is not only the story of the success, but also what was mentioned already, unfinished business. And here also let me reiterate that companies are still naming the same barriers that existed 20 years ago. Among them are lack of information on national procedures, complexity, disproportionate national requirements in the area of services, including mobility of professionals, burdensome administrative requirements for posting workers, and issues connected to taxation. Particularly important will be liberalization of services, and here boost in GDP can be measured by another 300 billion annually. Coordination of actions between member states, what was also mentioned by Mr. Anlit, is of utmost importance, and we have seen developments in this area like Single Market Enforcement Task Force or the plans to open single market offices in each member state. There are other new initiatives that are happening. For example, common e-declaration for posted workers might help ease barriers for companies, as well as, for example, the plans, actually not plans, but a unitary patent that will be implemented in June 2023 among most of EU member states, not all of them. But this should certainly simplify intellectual property protection and cooperation on this side. Thank you here, and let me move to our panel with distinguished guests. And with no further ado, let me invite Mr. Anders Anlit, Director General and Head of the National Board of Trade of Sweden. Ms. Katarzyna Broniarek, Country Communication Manager at IKEA Retail. Mr. Jan Hagemeyer, Vice President of Center for Social and Economic Research, Associate Professor at University of Warsaw. And last but not least, Ignacy Marowski, Chief Economist at Puls Biznesu and Director of Spot Data. Thank you very much. Thank you very much for coming again. And let me maybe, because Mr. Alnit opened the discussion with the keynote, so maybe let me move to a more practical perspective, so the business one. To our guest from IKEA Retail, Ms. Broniarek, I would be very grateful if you could describe IKEA's experience with working on the single market. I believe maybe the most problems that are still, and we described them, are maybe in services sector, but so not the biggest part of the IKEA business, but still, what do you see from your point of view when it comes to both, actually, why it's so easy on the single market and what are barriers existing for your business?
Thank you. Good morning, and thank you for the invitation. I can pretty much echo what has been said so far. At IKEA, we are great fans of a single market, and even though IKEA has expanded its business outside of Sweden decades before the single market was introduced, it has made it possible to speed up the process, so that our retail operations, our shopping centers, our production facilities, factories, etc., were able to expand and move outside of borders of home country of Sweden. Saying that, at IKEA we think of a single market as a key growth enabler for our company. Also, it helps us to make our business idea become reality, and our business idea is to provide good quality, well-designed products at a good price. So we need scale, we need massive production. So every initiative that helps us to harmonize production, rules that are consistent, simply help us to flourish as a business. I would like to use an expression in English that I really like. Saying all that, there is still a fly in an ointment, so there are still challenges that we face. And seemingly, as you said, the Services Directive is not something that affects us as much. But please remember that we are a franchise system. Inca Group, which I represent, which owns most of IKEA stores worldwide, is still a franchisee of Inter IKEA, and we have other franchisees as well. Just to give you a particular example, we still face challenges expanding and building new facilities, new stores, new shopping centers in EU countries. Some of those challenges go against, in our opinion, against the directive. Mostly are local, and it really differs from country to country how we can expand and invest. When it comes to other challenges, I think they would be more general and could apply to any other business and not only us, is that we see a tendency of protectionist tendencies and regulations, local regulations as being introduced at an alarming rate. Just to give you an example, labeling of products, packages we are required to use. It's becoming more and more complex to produce in Europe and to be able to sell those products within the EU. And if this tendency continues, it will hinder our mission that I mentioned, is to produce on a massive scale products that are available at good prices. We see the tendency to change the regulations while the EU regulations where they're adopted transposed into the national laws. For example, right now we're looking at the ESG regulations. That's a hot topic among businesses right now, and we are really curious what regulations we'll be facing in Poland after they will be transposed. Also, eco schemes. So different regulations locally we need to comply with, and what this causes is, of course, something that was mentioned before: higher administrative burden, simply to be able to comply with all the regulations, but also something that's super close to our hearts is that we believe that with the eco schemes, with having diverging rules, it simply makes it more difficult for EU to achieve climate neutrality goal, which we have set for 2050. So from our perspective, more single market the better, but also it is super important to have efficient transposition and adoption of EU regulations into national regulatory systems.
Thank you very much. So maybe let me ask another question about so we are speaking about challenges on the intra-European market, right? But what about these regulations comparing to other sides of the world, and how does it impact, how do these regulations and these challenges impact your thinking about potentially manufacturing in Europe for the rest of the world, so exporting from Europe? Does it make it more difficult because of these regulations, because of this wrong transposition of EU law, or these are different set of challenges, like, for example, energy prices and not enough workforce and wages and so on? So is our regulations a factor that are decreasing potential production in Europe for IKEA?
I wouldn't say it decreases the production potential. We are still, we plan long term. We produce a lot in Europe. Just to give you an example, Poland is the second largest production country for IKEA worldwide, just after China. So we produce roughly 20% of everything that's being sold in IKEA stores all around the world in Poland. So these are challenges, but we are really meant to stay, so to say. The labeling challenges I have mentioned are hindering and are not making our job easier. But obviously, if you want me to compare it to challenges we have working on other markets, labeling in China is a completely different story. It's way more complex. So we are still investing in our factories heavily. We are opening and starting cooperation with new suppliers, so external companies that supply for IKEA. But we simply do our best for our voice to be heard. That more harmonization, more consistencies, it's simply better for the business and not only for us. We believe it's better for European companies, and as it was mentioned before, it simply helps Europe become more competitive worldwide, but also to echo what His Excellency the Ambassador said, it also helps make Europe greener.
Thank you very much, and this is important, and we'll come back at the end of this first round to these issues, climate and nearshoring. But let me move now to Mr. Hagemeyer, with whom I had the privilege to discuss the same half a year ago, and I would like to ask you now the convergence question. Mr. Szymański said earlier that Central European countries benefited a lot, decreasing the development gap, but also he mentioned that Western European countries had the problems with reaching higher inequalities among them in recent decades. So what's your point of view here? How would you describe these disparities and dynamic of it, and how strongly should we take it into consideration?
Okay, so it's quite a difficult question, because with convergence.
Thank you.
Sorry.
Thank you.
No, convergence is a long-term process, right? So if we start speaking about the last decade, for example, well, shall we expect convergence within such a short period of time, or are we observing, noise, or are we observing long-term trends, and so on, so on? But I mean, if you just try to let's say focus on the period roughly in line with the single market functioning, then I mean, if you look at the so-called beta convergence, I mean, poor countries grow faster, then you can absolutely see that on average, right? So that's surely what's happening. And if we look at the Central Eastern Europe, the new member states, or whatever you want to call them, then this is evident that there have been convergence, and this convergence is still ongoing. If you look at the data for the last decade, then most of the new member states would actually reduce the distance to the EU average. But of course, if you look at the Western countries, there are some outliers there. In particular, the southern countries that would be lagging behind. But you also have Germany, who is actually sort of improving the distance from the EU average over the last decade, right? So, which is also one of the richest countries in Europe. But I mean, looking at what is driving convergence, so we did a study on that already 5 years ago, and we looked at sources of convergence in Europe, and it was done for the period of 1995 to 2014. And what we found out is that, first of all, convergence found in the EU over that period is almost entirely driven by the new member state catching up with the EU 15, and not within the EU 15. And also that this convergence is mostly driven by growth of exports, or in particular exports value added, and that's quite important from the point of view of the single market. Is that for the new member states, most of the growth, for example, for Poland, it's half of overall growth over that period. For Slovakia, is 2/3 of that growth is driven by exports, not by the supplies to the domestic market. So that's of course not only European integration, but it's also the fragmentation of EU production, the so-called offshoring, and so on and so on. But these are all processes that led to this very good growth performance of the new member states. However, but if you look at the last decade once again, and look once again at this same aggregate of countries, then you have countries that have certainly improved their income level and so on compared to the EU average. But for example, when you look at Slovakia is one of the countries where actually the catching up over the last decade was not really present, which is kind of worrisome. And if you think from the point of view of whether this is something that we should worry about, yeah, I mean, in particular, if you consider this, so to say, net payer, net contributor, net beneficiary of the EU funds, I mean, certainly with the change in the income distribution, this distribution of EU funds would have to be adjusted to this sort of a different levels. I mean, it would be kind of unfair for the poorer countries to fund the richer countries. But I want to, in particular, in the context of the single market, I wanted to look at something else that I looked at when I was looking at the data for convergence. In fact, I wanted to see whether we actually have any nominal convergence in the price levels across countries. And we already have, I mean, quite a lot of data on prices and on the price levels. And what we could see is that in goods, there is actually, over the last decade, a slight convergence in the goods prices, but still the differences in the price levels are very high. But then if you look at services, which is once again referring to the barriers, to the raising barriers in services and so on and so forth, what you see is actually you see a considerable divergence in the price levels in services across Europe over the last decade. So you have, if you look at the spread of price levels, it actually goes up, and this data finishes up in 2022. So we still don't have the period of the inflationary period there, which in fact, I mean. Given the difference in the inflation levels, could in fact lead to a convergence of prices. But I mean, if you think about all the single market instruments, price transparency, the supposed lack of barriers and so on, you shouldn't really see divergence of the service prices, in my opinion. Okay, thank you.
So actually, the data on these different price levels would, from the data point of view, also sign out that we have problems in barriers in trade and services, especially, right? So that's very interesting. And maybe one more thing. So you said that this convergence in Central Eastern European states was mostly driven by value added, by export of value added, of course, but. Can you say anything about what drove this lack of convergence in EU 15? With the outliers of the southern countries.
So actually, you don't see that much of convergence in, in the data that shows the domestic demand portions of the GDP and the exports. So it's not. It's hard to say whether it was less driven by one of these one of these factors. But there is also one thing that I wanted to add is when you discussed the benefits of the single market for the new member states, I think one thing that we sort of overlook here is that these countries had the access to the single market in most of the sectors already several years before the accession, right? So if you take a look at these growth effects and the trade effects in particular, this boost in trade was substantial already 4 years before accession. So in fact, your estimated effects might be much higher than the sole effects of the single market from 2004.
Yes, thank you. And actually, if I remember correctly, we also included this in calculations, this pre-accession harmonization of as well. So let me now move to Mr. Morawski, and I would like to ask you the crisis question, actually. So, because you have a very proper look daily on economic situation in Poland and Europe, and the single market and the EU was floating through many crises in recent years, starting from financial crisis and debt crisis, and now 2020 pandemic and Russian invasion to Ukraine. So choose crisis that you would maybe like to tackle, but what is your impression when it comes to resilience of European Union and single market against this crisis? Have we done enough to tackle these challenges rising from this crisis? And so how are we here dealing?
First of all, thank you very much for inviting me to this great discussion. I will start by mentioning that I work as an analyst in the newspaper, which belongs to the Swedish company, Bonnier. So we have some Swedish traits also. And I have to admit that within the company, there is a lot of exchange of know-how between different parts of the company in Europe. So I think at the company level, the economic integration works well. But at the more macroeconomic level, there are certainly more challenges. And I think that when we look at the last 2 years, certainly the EU entered this crisis period rather poorly, I would say. The start was poor. When COVID started, we saw a lot of measures introduced by countries that were not coordinated, and the European Commission struggled to manage at the basic level the reaction to the pandemic. So we saw, for example, the blockade of borders. We saw uncoordinated huge fiscal support for companies, which to some extent was normal, but on the other hand, I think it severely disrupted the single market. And the effects of the fiscal support during COVID are also seen today. Right? The huge inflation is to some extent the result of fiscal support, of very large liquidity support. And obviously, the stronger countries, those countries that are fiscally stronger, managed to, I would say, keep the economy more stable during the whole period. And the economies which are, I would say, less developed, like the Central European, ended up with higher inflation than on average. So I think that the size of the fiscal support and the fact that it was not coordinated, to some extent, is one of the reasons why we observe high inflation. And as my predecessor said, the inflation will also disrupt the common market because it induces differences between price levels, and it causes real exchange rates to fluctuate much more than usually. So the start was poor, and I remember there was an article by a famous Italian economist, Luigi Zingales, in Financial Times in April 2022, in which he wrote, "The EU must be forged in this crisis or it will die." So the Italians were clearly enraged at the beginning of the pandemic with the response of the European Union. And there was certainly a huge disappointment in Southern Europe with how the EU acts and reacts. But in the end, we are 3 years after the COVID started, and the EU has not died. So apparently, as usually, it muddled through. And I think that after the poor start, there were some successes also within the area of how common market works. So first of all, I think that the big success is the fact that no, I would say, important protective measures were introduced by member states. So the free trade and free investment flows were maintained and were not subject of some huge controversies, despite the fact that on the global level, we certainly saw an increased protectionism, especially in the United States. So common market worked well, and after the initial recession, we observed a huge rebound in trade and investments, especially concentrated in countries which are dependent on manufacturing, because during COVID, consumers switched from services to goods, right? So they did not go to cinema or to holiday abroad, but they bought a new washing machine or TV set or other appliances. So all countries that depend on manufacturing, like Central European Manufacturing Hub, benefited from the structural changes induced by the pandemic. And as you showed in your slide, the international trade rebounded strongly. Moreover, investment flows rebounded strongly. And you can observe that FDI, foreign direct investments, increased both inwards and outwards in Poland and in Central Europe and in the whole European Union. So I think that the economic, I would say the machine of economic integration, after all, worked quite well. After this initial period of, I would say, turbulence and problems. But anyway, I still think that there are some concerns that could be raised. My predecessors talked a lot about regulation. I think it's a very important point, but I don't think that we should concentrate all our attention on regulation. And to give you an example, I think we should ask a question: why, after the COVID, when a lot of areas in the economy digitized, right, went online, why have we not observed any large online companies expanding in Europe, European companies? So, for example, Amazon did very well in Europe, right? It expanded in many countries, it increased sales. We have Amazon shop in Poland, in Germany, and in many other countries, but we don't have any very large European online company. like which could compete with Amazon. There are some examples of companies like Glovo, right? Glovo, a very successful company in which you can order. I don't know if it's present in Sweden. Do you have Glovo? No? Glovo. Glovo. No. Okay. So it's very successful in Poland and for example in Spain or in some other countries, but not in those most developed European countries like France or Germany. So it is an interesting case study showing that you have a very dynamic startup, an online startup, which grows very fast, but only at selected markets. And the question is why? And I think that this question is very much related to the crucial point that you raised in your speech about the question why the European Union registers slower GDP growth, also GDP per capita, because this is important, than United States and China. So one answer would be regulation. So the issue that everyone talked here. So we have too much fragmented regulations about taxes, posting workers, labels, packaging, etc. But I'm not entirely convinced that this is the most important answer to the question about growth and the question why Europe lags behind United States in digital economy. I think it has a lot to do with cultural segmentation and differences, right? If you look at US, this is not only a single market. This is a single country. They have countrywide TV programs, companies, I don't know, sport leagues, right? Culture in general. Whereas Europe is fragmented not only in regulatory aspects, but also in I would say everyday aspects of life. So I don't think that we can easily manage the challenge of fragmentation in Europe. And I also don't think that this is the most important drawback. So we have regulation. I think cultural differences might be more important. And the question is what to do with this challenge. It's not easy to address. And the third, I think, drawback, which might prevent faster growth, is a trade-off between cohesion and growth. Europe is a very successful economic area in terms of, I would say, quality of life and cohesion. So, for example, the employment rate in Europe, I don't know if it's, it rebounded faster than in United States after COVID, and it is generally higher than in United States. Right, so more people work in Europe than in US. I mean, the higher share of people who are capable to work, in fact, work in Europe than in the United States, right? The poverty rates in Europe are lower. The income differences between regions are lower. You don't have a lot of examples of regions like, for example, Detroit in the United States, which is a totally devastated economically city because the manufacturing of automobiles moved to China or somewhere else, and they did not manage to find any growth engines. So Europe is doing very well in terms of quality of life and cohesion. And I think so that to some extent, there might be a trade-off between cohesion and growth. So, and the key question in my example is, to what extent can we somehow give up on social, I would say, safety to increase GDP growth? I don't have any good answer to that question. But I think there is to some extent a trade-off between how fast you grow and how cohesive or equal the growth process is. So I think that Europe is very successful in some terms, but not in other terms. And the question is how to, I would say, manage the success in one area with starting up growth processes in other areas.
Thank you. Very interesting point, and actually, one might also say about easiness to going bust, for example, and how you can survive it and go further and establish another entity, for example, in the US versus in the EU. So maybe that's a very interesting point. But maybe I would like to dig deeper into this cohesion. So at first, you said actually that the response of the EU wasn't so good for all member states, and you finalized about the cohesion notion, that we are more cohesive. But let me ask you about the fairness. So easy question. If you see this, how single market, how it looks like, and how it's managed now, fair for all the member states.
I would say more or less yes. If we could ask more general question, is free market fair? I mean, free market is an area where entities which are richer and stronger are in advantage, right? So is it fair that people who are richer and stronger have advantage? I don't know, but this is how the free market works. So in general, I think there are a lot of complaints about the fairness of the European market, which are overhyped. And I can give you one example. The regulations about transport sector and mobility package. There was, it was introduced in the last couple of years from the initiative of France, who tried to block, to some extent, the expansion of Polish transport companies on the European market. Because Polish companies are responsible for around, for example, 25% of goods transporting between Germany and France. Right? So there is a huge role of Polish companies in the Western markets. And the mobility package was introduced, which imposed some regulatory obligations on companies and in theory made it more difficult for Polish companies to operate in Europe. So there was a lot of, I would say, complaints in Poland that this is a way to block the expansion of Polish companies, that this is not fair, etc., etc. But in the end, if you look at the data and if you talk to Polish companies, it did not cause a lot of harm, right? So the expansion of trade services, of transport services by Polish companies is still very strong. The position of Polish companies on the Western markets is well established, and it is difficult to unroot them from there. Even if you talk to large Polish companies, they don't say that the mobility package is something that prevented them from expanding in Europe. So in the end, I think that this regulation did not change the overall trend of increasing exports of Polish transport services, right? So I will sort of take up on the point that I said previously. To me, the regulatory issues are quite often overhyped. Companies very often say that they cannot grow because there are regulations that prevent them to grow. No, it is an easy talking point, an easy complaint, but it's too often exaggerated.
So actually, I participated in a European Economic Congress in Katowice a few weeks ago, and I had there quite a vivid session on regulations in the European Union and how they are affecting Polish industrial companies, and that they cannot compete fairly on the single market, and actually they cannot compete on the global market. So they will move. They will be moving somewhere where it's cheaper to produce. And here, I would like to invite Mr. Anli to with the global stage question. So regulations. Are they overhyped or not? Are they making us competitive, or they decrease competitiveness of the European Union? How do you see it?
Well, thank you. Since I'm representing a agency that seek to deals with good regulation, I cannot completely agree with Ignacio, I think, on this not being important, because I think it is, and I think one has to be very careful on the EU single market to make sure that we regulate in a forward-looking and good manner. There are simple principles that have to be followed. We shouldn't regulate so that the burden on companies becomes unnecessarily large, and that should be done in a harmonized and in a manner that is covering all EU member states at the same level. Transparency, of course, is key, and some kind of principles of this sort that we need to uphold. And I think, as I tried to mention in my speech, that presently we see too much of openings for continued member state regulation in certain areas, including when it comes to labeling and other areas where companies face difficulties. So I for one, would definitely argue that this is an area where we have to make progress, we have to do better, and that is important also for the competitiveness of our European Union on a global market. But may I just make one comment on what also we heard about the European cohesion and the fact that we are in our European Union upholding safety nets of a sort that maybe not all partners around the world are doing. Because I think one can turn that argument a bit upside down as well compared to what Ignacio said, just mentioned. Because I would argue that it's thanks to the establishment of social welfare, a good labor market policy, that a country is prone to structural adjustment, the structural adjustment that is constantly needed to uphold productivity and competitiveness. While this is not a sufficient factor for becoming a world leader, it is, I think, a necessary factor for doing so. And there are other, of course, technological measures and environment for innovation that it will be even more important. But I don't think this is only a drag on competitiveness and economic growth. It can also be helpful.
If you may want to comment, please.
I entirely agree with what you said. I didn't want to make a point that regulations are not important. I just think that they are sometimes overhyped. But this point about the cohesion is extremely important, even much more important than the regulations, I think. Because I agree, cohesion helps growth in some aspects, certainly. And I like the European model. I'm not against it. I'm just saying that in some areas, it might sometimes it might prevent growth. To give you an example, Europe would probably need a capital markets union to grow faster. So we would need our capital markets to integrate, right? So they will be more liquid, more companies issuing stocks and investing in innovations, etc. But for countries like Poland, it might be a risk. Because we have our small local capital market, which, it's not perfect, but it works. If there is a European-wide capital market, it might be, under some assumptions, more difficult for Polish companies to get access to capital, for Polish investors to invest in the stock market. So, I want to say that when you unify certain markets, you create challenges at the local level. And this is an example of the trade-off between protecting, I would say, local specific characteristics and creating a fast and competitive European economy.
And so maybe to add to this, so here we have also the question of the global competition with United States going more protectionistic country, and with IRA. And so we have two flips of the coin here, and on the one hand you said that we need to be still open, on the other hand inside we need to be cohesive and maybe sometimes defend what's working. So how would you see this single market situation in these turbulent times of increased subsidies, competition worldwide? And maybe let me also add to this that trade, technology, climate, resilience nexus actually. So how can we sail here between climate protection and issue of nearshoring that might be vital when it comes to resilience of our value chains? We have Russian invasion in Ukraine that changed a lot when it comes to the perspective on the global stage, not to mention the prospective risks that might happen in other places in the world. So here, how should it be addressed when it comes to single market?
Well, I think that we need a more self-confident European Union that can stake out its own approach in this difficult world that we are now having. We shouldn't only react to what others do. I think we know what works, we know what doesn't. We need a trade policy that is evidence-based again. We should not fall in the fallacy of kind of, as we heard, engaging in a subsidy war with the Americans. That would be against our interests. We should not do what the Chinese are doing, state intervention that seeks to find the winners. It would also be against our interests. I think both China and the United States are now pursuing policies that in the long run will not favor these economies. We should uphold the single market upon the basis of the rules of competition, the strict, in due course, hopefully again, strict state aid rules, and create this framework for productive business opportunities for our companies. It's easy to say, it's difficult maybe to do, but I think that it's that route we have to follow. And it is evident that our European Union is far more dependent on global markets than both the United States and China, and therefore we need to make sure that the global markets are as open as possible. I don't like the concept of friendshoring, but it is still possible to improve our trade relations with trusted allies, and that should be done without completely breaking the possibilities to also conduct legitimate trade with an important country like China, which is not least important for a company like IKEA. So one should tread carefully in this respect. And as I also said in my statement, we still have to stand up also for the World Trade Organization in this world, because not many other big parties do at this stage.
Yes, so if one follow-up question here, and maybe we have still about 10 minutes, I see. So let me say that I will open the floor for questions if the audience should have any. But you said that we shouldn't do, and it will be detriment to both the US and China, what they are doing about subsidies, for example. But on the other hand, actually, if what they are doing, we cannot change them not to, especially China, for example. And on the other hand, when it comes to WTO, without the US, it's a very difficult ship to sail and navigate. Actually, it's without one of the most important elements of it, so the arbitration mechanism. So here, is it, so shouldn't we actually somehow assess that the world is changing, and we need to as a single market to also to somehow answer to these challenges? with what we wouldn't like to do, right?
We mustn't be naive, and maybe we have been naive in a way back before. We have to take economic security seriously, evidently, and we have to adapt to a new world in which the globalization is different compared to the globalization we've seen for the past 20 or 30 years. But I think still that doesn't mean that we should give up on policies that we know are still functioning. And it's not only the United States and China that we relate to. We have other parts of the world that still need to trade with our single market. Europe is still the largest trade entity on this globe, and that also means a responsibility not only for our citizens and our workers in the EU, but also countries like in the African countries and others, which we still want to uphold good relations with, of course. And that responsibility, I think, is also one that is incumbent on our European Union, also in these circumstances.
Thank you. So I promised to come back. To one more question to Ms. Broniarek. So from your business point of view, have you observed any ideas of nearshoring in IKEA? So decreasing these long value chains and so shortening of them, or more investments in production sites in Europe in this trend of nearshoring?
In a way, yes. We had a crisis after another. First one that during the pandemic, the problems with the supply chain. Then last year we made a very, very quick decision as one of the first companies to withdraw our business from Russia, including production. So there's a lot of discussion regarding supply chains right now, and we see that, for example, shipping a part of a kitchen cabinet from the US to Europe probably doesn't make much sense if we could produce it here. I'm oversimplifying on purpose. So for us, the current situation is one reason to do that. The second one, that's part of our DNA as a company, is sustainability. So we are still a global company. We'll still, our supply, it's going to be a global supply, but there's a lot of work going on right now of how to optimize the whole system for us to be more resilient.
Thank you very much. So, as I promised, this is the time for questions from the audience, if there are any. Mr. Director.
Okay, so I'm going to break the ice and ask the first question, because I heard the lot of interesting points made by the panelists and, of course, the speeches before. And I have a question. Basically, I'm going to come back to it. Just two comments. First one to Ignacy, who was talking about the businesses and how, European businesses, and how they were advancing the challenges created by the pandemic and the economic reality that we had post-2020. And I was thinking of the smaller businesses as the examples that you were giving. For example, InPost, that managed to create more business across Europe, increases valuation. You had also those smaller app companies which were present on some of the markets, but they were building on their own capability. So they used the resources that they had before. We had, cross-border EU-wide, we use Amazon or eBay. Those are American companies. So if we had any other solution, as some markets that use Allegro, for example, in Central and Eastern Europe, then that most probably, these would grow, but we don't have cross-European, and this is a very, very good point. And I also think that the mobility package, with the complaints of all the businesses, because they were also from Lithuania, Romania, it helped to water down what the initial proposal was. That's a very important element. So the very high peak voices coming from businesses that they're going to be destroyed, killed by the regulation, I think was an important matter in order to water down the bill. But I have a question on IRA and to our guest from Sweden. So do you think that we're going in the good direction in terms of the internal European debate on IRA. We have more available state aid with the current regulatory framework proposed by the European Commission. Now you have a proposal coming from Minister Habeck from Germany on a tariff for electricity, which is going to be at a subsidized level for for businesses using renewable energy for some parts of the business, as far as I know. They want to have it as a solution implemented across Europe, but of course it's going to be beneficial for the industry in Germany. So we do have a free-for-all kind of mechanism right now, pretty much also lack of coordination in terms of what is going to be available as a response to the threat that some of the industry sees in the IRA proposal. What do you think? What the Swedish kind of way of thinking is going to be present in the next months or years? Thank you.
So, Mr. Anit, please, first.
No, it is a challenging situation, evidently. I think, as I've said before, that we have gone too far in our European Union in loosening up the state aid regimes. I think it will not be conducive to long-term productivity, and it's also kind of contributing to a situation in which some member states more easily can use this alleged positive opening better and more than others. So it also risks destroy the level playing field within our European Union. So what would the alternative be? Continue to make sure that we have incentives for establishing or redirecting our economies towards the green transition, and I think that can be done without resort to these huge subsidies by other regulatory incentives and improvements that we have been seeking. And in that context, I think the European way of pricing CO2 is a very good way forward that one should be proud of in our part of the world, and hopefully see others follow as well. Concerning the electricity issue you brought up, I must confess that I'm not knowledgeable enough to comment on that.
Thank you very much. And Ignacio, would you like to also comment? Or no? Okay. Yeah. Are there any more questions from the audience? Yes, Magdalena Cedro from Polityka Insight.
Hello, thank you very much. And I have a question, leaving aside the question if overregulation is overhyped. I would like to ask how to protect effectively the single market. Of course, the European Commission is a guardian of the single market, but my question is, does it do enough to protect the single market from barriers, and is it capable of doing so without the political will in the European capitals?
Would you like to direct to someone from the panel? Or okay, so please, who would like to answer this question first? So maybe in the first order, Ms. Broniarek, would you like to comment?
Quoting my predecessor, I'm afraid I'm not knowledgeable enough to comment on this one.
So actually, I mean, there is a very nice report by the European Commission on the 30th anniversary of the single market. And one of the things that it's there is this issue of, deficit in compliance or deficit in transposition of the EU law, which is actually increasing in some of the member states. So I mean, in a way, to answer your question, whether the European Commission is doing enough to protect the single market, well, maybe it's not, right? But of course, the willingness has to be on the parties on the part of the member states as well to comply with the Euro regulations fully. And in particular, I mean, if you think once again when we go back to the issue of the trade in services and think about how big are those barriers, so there is a lot of studies about estimating barriers in trade in services and so on and so on. And these are way higher than the ones in goods, right? I mean, in particular, if you think about administrative barriers. So there are tariff equivalents, a tax that would be equivalent to the barrier that's regulatory, and these might, range between 30 to 150%, right? So these regulatory barriers can be really prohibitive to trade. And yeah, I mean, of course, there is always a question whether this is the lack of compliance, whether it's just because of the general unwillingness to comply, or whether it's driven by the domestic lobby of service providers, right? And that's, of course, a question for another debate. Thank you.
Someone else, maybe Mr. Rennet, please.
May I just very briefly, I think it's a very important question, and I would like to come back to this proposal by the Commission on instigating single market offices. It might seem bureaucratic, and people are often not very keen to add new structures to the bureaucratic structures we already have. But I think this is an important addition that could be very helpful. When we look at how the European Union handle the way of compliance on the domestic scene in competition, when it comes to data, when it comes to intellectual property rights, there is always a cooperation between the Commission and the national authority. In the area of the single market that we're talking about, the Services Directive, the mutual directive for mutual recognition, we have no such domestic hand to make sure that the system works. And properly instituted, I think this can be a step forward that could hopefully bring us forward. There is a problem, as you indicated, that the large member states are not very keen to see this. But I hope that one day even countries like France and Germany will see the virtues of a step in this direction.
Thank you very much. So if I may delay by a few minutes your lunch, I would like to maybe one final question to all panelists willing to answer it. So what conclusion can we draw from Brexit? Because it's actually quite an important development from the last 5 years. That happened for the single market. It was a big decrease for the potential of the single market. Of course, we have the deep FTA with Great Britain afterwards, but still it's impacting the functioning of the single market, its potential. And so do you see some problems of single market or its successes as one of the factors that Brexit actually happened? So do you see any problems here that we should be taking into consideration also in the future? Ms. Brenner,
if I could just comment really shortly, like from our very practical perspective, administrative burden and the chaos we have encountered after breakfast, how our daily business has become more difficult. We're making it work. Of course, IKEA works in Great Britain. We sell furniture, but the work behind has been huge. So, I really hope that everybody can draw conclusions from this, not only from a business perspective, but from a more general perspective. Do not do it again, ever. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr.
I just want to say that the early estimates of the drops in trade for the EU-UK trade are, they are quite high, and in fact, all those estimates that were done ex ante would materialize almost fully after already 2 years, right? So that's a very big impact. And of course, I mean, if you look at the public opinion polls in the UK right now, the Brexit would not have happened, right? So that is that means a lot. I mean, that the actual impact must have been pretty bad in a way. So yeah, let's not do that. Yeah.
Thank you, Mr. Morawski. Would you like to comment?
Well, to me, the lesson from Brexit is that politics wins over, I would say, economic calculations very often, and this is a warning. We can talk about strategies and about projections, about big numbers and big effects of single market, but in the end, the political process might go in a totally different way. And we have to answer the question why that happens. And that's why I think that the issues of regulations, to me, these are details that can be dealt with when there is will and leadership, right? So to me, the vision of Europe, the leadership, is probably the most important thing when thinking about the future of Europe. And regulations are details that will be worked out. So the lesson from Brexit is that politics may triumph over economic calculations, and this is a huge warning.
Thank you, and Mr. Arnott.
Very briefly, I agree on what was just said, that one lesson is that populism should not be allowed to enter into equations of this sort in the future, hopefully. But that also means that we have to make sure that we have politicians that understand and see how policies are evidence-based. Make trade policy evidence-based again. Make single market policy evidence-based again. And if we succeed in that endeavor, hopefully this can be avoided. And I think that a lesson from Brexit is that the rest of us, the 27 of us that are left, have hopefully seen how important and brilliant the single market still is, even if it's not perfect.
And thank you very much. With this, I will close our panel. So please join me in thanking our panelists. Thank you very much. And I hand over.
Yeah. Thank you very much. Please stay. There's lunch. So that's the important message I want to leave you with. But as you can see, the costs of No Europe, as in the report since the 80s, are quite high. And there are a lot of benefits of Europe that we can see in terms of calculations, discussions, business opportunities. And I do think that this stays with us. Okay, lunch is coming. So.